measure the time delay ended to betray your data center.
But now I gotta cool down, chill, I rock a dope crowd. Hit you up with headphones and take your ass to Rhinetown.
All right, mic check. Is it okay? All right. All right, thanks for everyone to come hear me talk there. And of course, thanks to everyone for organizing and putting this together. It's been a great event so far. And my name's Adam Hogan. I'm a consulting security engineer with Cisco. I came over by way of the acquisition of SourceFire, where I'd been for about 5 years before they picked us up. I want to talk today about actually malware evolution and epidemiology, which is actually going to be a little different for me. This is not at all a technical talk. I don't have any software to show. There's no actual exploits going on. What we're going to do is just talking about some malware concepts and compare them to what biologists have learned about evolution. So we're going to take a look at those theories, and I'm going to steal those theories and sort of map them over to security. Say, what does it look like? And based on what we've learned about how life evolves and changes, what can we learn about malware? Right? So. All right. Is it working now? Okay, so we're going to talk about some theories of evolution, how we can apply that to malware epidemiology, which is sort of the next logical move over is once we understand that there is a problem, of course, science then looks then to how to stop it, right? And we'll take a look at some of the models that lead to these theories, these predictions, and take a look at the predictions they create, which of course not only hopefully tell us something about what's coming down the road, what we can expect in the future, but also a way to validate this whole process. Okay, looks like we're working now. So we are talking about evolution. So the whole idea of evolution is they can describe any iterative process where the most fit is going to win, the least fit are going to disappear. Okay. Now this can apply to all sorts of things. Frankly, a lot of things human beings do can be described as an evolutionary process because learning by doing is an evolutionary process, right? If you're going to try something, you're going to give it a shot. If it doesn't work that well, you're going to try something else. That's a mutation. If that works better, you're going to keep doing that. That's an idea propagating, right? So the growth of technology itself is an evolutionary process, right? So I'm taking the general idea behind evolution and looking at that, okay? Which is to say, we're sort of applying it almost to a social science, and I am in no way discussing where the hell life came from. We're not talking about that at all, and I don't care what you think about it. All right, so a lot of time when people think of evolution, they think of animals evolving against nature, right? And a lot of theory is focused on that. The idea being, if we look at, we talk about, okay, giraffes have these really long necks because they're around trees that are way high up there. The longer neck you have, you can reach it, right? So you're kind of evolving to your environment and to nature. Camel gets a hump, they're in the desert, right? If they were surrounded by water, they wouldn't have a need for it. Dolphins got echolocation because it's useful to them in their environment. But nature isn't life's greatest threat. It's maybe one of the more obvious. We can look at that and say, okay, those are all really good examples of those creatures having adapted to their environment. But on a more constant basis, the real threat is really coming from predators, from competition, so people at the same straight level going after the same food source, for example, and parasites. So the question really then is, do we have predators in software, right? If we're going to think of the evolution of malware, if we're going to think of how software is affected by these changes, the idea is, so is software being attacked? Are there predators to it? Of course, in nature, we see it all the time, right? One sees another, its primary source of energy. So they go after, kill it, and eat it, right? Is there a corollary in software? I'm not sure. Maybe exploits for the sake of destruction, right? If your purpose is to DOS a box, maybe that's a predatory action, but I'm not sure that's a clear corollary. Competition, we absolutely see competition in nature. Another species competing for the same resource, right? Of course, we see that in software. Software does compete with each other. There are alternatives for every piece of software. There's another one you can go and do it to have a similar way of doing it, right? So there's definitely competition there. We should expect software to change as a response to its competitors, right? Rival software. But I think perhaps more importantly, evolution is being driven by parasites, right? Disease, fungus, and parasitic animals affect things in nature. And I would suggest that we actually look at malware as a parasite on software. Right? Now, we're actually learning a lot about how parasites sort of drive changes in animals, and it's considerable. I mean, it's absolutely enormous. It's been ignored for a long time. So it's an absolutely fascinating subject. It's also a terrifying subject. If this is all interesting, you're thinking, hey, I'm going to learn some more about parasites because I'm going to talk a lot about it here. You may not want to. If you enjoy nature, if you think, wow, look at the beautiful mother Gaia, I want to go out and enjoy nature, don't read about parasites. It's terrifying. If you enjoy sushi, don't read about parasites, right? This is a parasitic wasp. It's injecting its eggs to hatch inside of this caterpillar, where they will then, eat it from the inside out. This little critter here in the middle gets inside this fish. It gets inside its mouth, eats its tongue, and replaces it. It goes on to act as the fish's tongue, where it can sort of have first pick at the food it's eating, right? Anyone see this one before? This is the Candiru fish. The Candiru fish leeches on to other fish, right? And sucks the blood out of them. The way it finds fish in water is by sensing ammonia, which is sort of given off by fish's gills. So if it smells ammonia, it will swim to it and latch on, right? You know what else smells like ammonia? Urine. So if you go swimming where there are Candiru fish, you can end up with these little guys inhabiting your urethra, bladder, or scrotum while they make a meal of it. Yeah. I'm serious. This is goddamn terrifying stuff. This ant is crawled up to the top of a blade of grass, right? We talk about zombies and botnets all the time, think it's this creative idea to take over and slave a computer. Nature has come up with all this shit before, right? So this ant has had parasites in it. It has actually hacked this ant's brain and made it climb to the top of this blade of grass, which is a very stupid thing for an ant to do. Thing is, the parasite living inside this ant doesn't want to live inside an ant. It wants to live inside a sheep. So it jacks this guy's brain, makes it climb to the top of a blade of grass where it will get eaten by a sheep, and it will be able to move on to the next stage of its life, right? These river flukes, by the way, were the inspiration behind the aliens in Alien, right? The whole idea of moving from like egg to chestburster to all that. No, not that original. Nature's horrifying. All right, so the idea I want to propose then is we can look at malware as parasites on our host, on our software, right? So the idea is, do we fit that definition? Does malware depend on its host? Well, certainly, right? It's requiring that environment to live in, right? So I'd say yes. Does malware harm its host? And that's always an interesting question. Well, I think the ultimate response there is, does the susceptibility to malware, does software's vulnerability influence your decision to choose it or buy it, right? If you have a choice between a lot of web browsers and choose to move away from a more vulnerable one to a more secure one, that's an act of fitness. That is nature disregarding a species that's been riddled with parasites, right? So I think the same actions are governing that process. All right, so your web browser is a good example. So what good is that? Well, not only are we able to say, okay, this is parasites, but parasites actually follow a very particular kind of evolution. So we can look to that. In parasitology, this type of evolution is known as the Red Queen problem. And that's actually taken from Alice in Wonderland. We're talking about Alice gets and meets the Red Queen, and one of the things they do actually first is they have to run as fast as they can in order to stay in the same place. All right, so it actually talks about this. So the Red Queen makes them run and says, you have to run faster, you have to run faster, and they do that just to stay in the same place. And Alice says, hey, if you ran, where I'm from, if you ran really fast a long time, you'd get somewhere. And the Red Queen ridiculed her, so that's a very slow sort of country. Here you have to, it takes all the running you can just to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. The idea behind that is that if a parasite evolves to attack a host very much, then the host has to evolve a new way to defend against it, which causes the parasite to come up with a new way to get around it, right? And that is always happening. There's an arms race between the parasite and host. And what it means is, well, that's always going on, then it's not going to get any easier, right? As long as that foe is there, as long as you depend on each other, that process is going to continue to happen. Each is going to try to evolve. You know, the person being attacked is going to try and evolve a defense. The parasite is going to try and come up with something better then, right? In other words, standing still is falling behind. And I think this describes security very well, right? You have to continue moving even to stay in the same place, which means if you want to be a pretty good security product, you have to keep changing, right? When we talk about like, oh, you remember such and such product, now it sucks. It used to be good back in the day, now it sucks. That product didn't decide one day, like most of the time that product didn't like take a change and just start sucking overnight. What happened is it just stood still, right? When we think about products that sort of fallen off, right? It's not because they got worse, they stayed the same and everyone else moved, right? So I say this process describes security very, very well. All right, so if we do understand this, if we see a field where evolution is governed by this Red Queen problem, we're going to have this situation where you have to, evolve or die. You're going to have to see continuous improvement, right? She's a fickle mistress. Well, what can we learn from this, right? So the more successful a parasite's attack, the more a host's chance of survival depend on whether or not it can invent a defense. And the better it defends, the more natural selection will promote parasites that can overcome the defense, right? So the advantage will actually always be swinging between the two. So what prediction can we take from this? Well, if this process is actually governing the way malware changes over time, then we should see cycles of different types of malware. When they become wildly successful, defenses are going to have to improve. Everyone's going to adopt these new defenses, and that's going to cause people writing malware to have to come up with something new and better, right? So the question then is, does that describe the world we live in? I would argue yes, right? As we've seen major jumps in malware changes, we've seen, okay, we got viruses, and over time, we came up with antivirus is going to block against all that. We had macroviruses. We came up with defenses against that. Kind of we get around to worms here in 2000, start seeing a lot more hackers. We saw spyware and rootkits being a huge problem. A little bit after that, and now we're seeing the rise of all this APT problem. Take a drink. And this sort of modern malware, right? I don't know where we are. I don't know if it's peaked yet or will later. But I think that this process does describe malware and how it's changed over time. Okay, so let's move on to some of the other principles we can take from civilizations that follow this, right? First is called the life dinner principle. So here we have a fox chasing a rabbit. All right, and that actually comes from research by Dawkins and Krebs. So a rabbit is running from a fox. It's running for its life, right? So we have, what's the possible outcomes of this chase? It's going to get caught or not. Well, if the rabbit loses, it dies. If the fox loses, it's still hungry. Very different set of incentives, right? Rabbit has the greater incentive. It is literally running for its life. And it's most of the time going to win. And if you watch rabbits, foxes chasing rabbits, more often than not, the rabbit gets away. Right? It has that impetus. Of course, fox doesn't go hungry. It catches one every now and then. But for the most part, it's going to get away. So the lesson that sort of leads us to when we look at evolution, when we look at these processes over time, is that the specialist will usually win the race. All right, that's sort of a general conclusion that biologists have taken from the evolution of malware. So here's a question. If the specialist always wins, who is more specialized? People writing malware or those of us working in security? I would argue malware, right? Yeah, I would think so. So I think it's an important thing to come away with, and if we can take something away from it, it would be that if you're in an environment where you're not training your technical folk, they already suck, right? Again, we're in this Red Queen process. If you are standing still, you are falling behind, right? You have to keep doing research just to stay in the same level. If you think, okay, my skill level is here, if you're not doing a certain amount of research, you're just falling to the wayside, right? Because you are on that Red Queen treadmill as well, right? It's like a treadmill, one of the motorized treadmills, right? You're going to have to keep moving just to stay in the same spot. So if there's any managers in the audience, obvious lesson. I mean, you guys got to get trained. If you want to be a great manager, if you're managing like a technical team, the best way you can do it is consider it your job to keep your technical people out of meetings. All right, so another take at what we can learn from evolutionary theory is to look at the life cycle of a disease. And I'll actually come back to this in some more detail later. But when we look at the life cycle of disease, what usually happens is it starts out very nasty and then gets more mild. That is, when a new variant of the flu comes around, it's very bad, right? We'll see a lot of people hospitalized, but that same variant over time sort of evens out. It doesn't hurt as many people. So if you're a parasite, you have some options there, right? If you want to replicate as much as possible, you can do that, but it's usually harmful to the host, right? If you're a virus inside somebody, if you're a bunch of worms inside somebody, right? You can replicate as much as possible and be very, very successful that way. But if you do it too much, you can kill the host, right? So if you're surrounded by unresistant hosts, say like you're the flu, if you're surrounded by people who are vulnerable to the flu, it doesn't really matter if you kill your host, right? Because you've already spread to other people. They've already been infected. That being said, if it's unlikely that you're going to spread or you're not going to spread from other people very fast, then you have to keep your host alive, right? It's a goose laying the golden egg. That's your environment now. So you have to keep them alive. So as we see over time, the sort of virulence, the actual damage done by a disease, tapers off over time. Right? So as people become more resistant, a parasite must be careful not to kill the host. This is also comes into play a lot when there's competition between parasites. That's where it can get a little complicated. Say there's two viruses inside you. Well, if one's replicating faster than the other, it can actually beat out the second virus, right? It can say, oh, no, I'm taking over this body. If it's replicating faster, the other one can actually die out that way. So there's actually an evolutionary pressure for them to replicate faster. In that case, it's actually more harmful to the host. So prediction here, if this is going to be modeled the same way with with malware, right? Then as malware improves, as malware, say, evolves and matures a bit, then we should see less denial of server. We should see less systems crashing from malware, and we actually see more access, right? If the goal is to get onto a system, infect it, and siphon information off, then we should see malware mature to the point where it's not harming a host, right? If you want to survive on a host, the idea is you're going to sit there and gather banking passwords, right? Then the way to be successful is not be detected. And that means from antivirus and also by the user. So if your malware is written so poorly that it's blue screening, if it's slowing down the system, that's going to cause the user to go out and investigate what's happened, right? The evolutionary pressure for a parasite is to not affect the host. Make a meal of the host without them noticing, right? To that end, there's an incredible debate in biology whether a tapeworm should be considered a very basic form of life or an incredibly advanced one. Most biologists would say a tapeworm is a very simple life form. It's seriously like sex organs and a bag of eggs and like a hook. That's it, right? They say, well, that's a very simple life form. It doesn't have any limbs, doesn't have any eyeballs, right? Well, it doesn't need them. It doesn't need any of those things. It's that evolved to its host, right? Most people, when you have a tapeworm, you'll never know it, right? You don't really lose weight. It doesn't eat that much of your food. You don't really get sick. Sometimes you get anemia. They do like B12. Sometimes they eat too much of that. Most people don't know they have a tapeworm until it dies and evacuates. Right? Because it is that well adapted to humans. Right? So we should expect to see more of that from malware. As malware becomes more mature, we should actually have less of a negative effect on the user itself, as well as we want to avoid being detected by security.
What happens when malware activates?
Yeah, you have to reimage Windows, I think. It's just, eventually there's so much shit, you got to start over. All right, so how do animals defend from parasites? Of course, we want to go somewhere positive. Right? That's how do we use this information? How do we fight back? So there's a few general strategies animals have to get away from parasites. First is to grow and divide fast enough to leave parasites behind. Right? There's an evolutionary risk that the parasite wants to change enough where it can attack the host very well. If the host can change faster, it's going to get away. There's also sex, which is it's certainly the first time I've been able to talk at a security conference about sex on stage. But sex is actually, the running theory now is the whole reason animals develop sex in the first place is to get away from parasites. I'll come back to each of these. And the third would be evolve an immune system to deal with these things. Right? So development speed, the first one we talked about. All right, so one of the reasons diseases are such a problem is because they replicate so much faster, right? In 10 years, the genes of the AIDS virus change as much as the human genes change over 10 million years, right? Now, each iteration of that is another chance to become a more dangerous or better formed parasite or disease. Whereas if we, say the human body can't change that fast, we're sort of stuck, right? The parasite is going to be able to change faster and it's going to be able to attack us better. So we have to explore, is this going to be an issue? So what's developed faster? Legitimate software or malware? Malware, right? So there's a possible solution there. If we develop software so much faster that we got away from malware, we would be able to get away from it. Doesn't sound like a very good solution, though, does it, right? I mean, if you were changing software that fast, you'd spend your entire life in training classes. So I'm not sure that's actually a viable solution. All right, but maybe we can speed up software development to actually get away from it if we're using different stuff. Well, the prediction from this is actually we should see opportunistic infections. Because a parasite has to take care of its host, if a host is dying out, there's less reason to be nice to it. So, Windows XP, not supported anymore, right? There's no revenue to be had from it. There's not going to be patching for it. So, if these theories hold, not only should we still see malware out there for XP, but we should see worse malware out there for XP. So, right, as time goes on, the malware we see for XP, I think we will see more blue screens. We'll see it's going to be a lot more likely to slow the machine down. It's going to be more likely to have an adverse effect because it's not really going to matter as much to it if it's detected, right? So I think malware affecting XP as a dying system is actually going to get a lot sloppier. Let's see, comparing populations. One of the things we can also get out of this theory is that there is a correlation between generation length and the amount of recombination, right? The longer a given life form is alive, the more it's going to want its offspring to be different from it. Right? So longer generations, more genes must change between generations, which I think matches, right? Is there more new features when you go to Internet Explorer 7 to 8 or say from Windows Vista to Windows 7, right? A lot more new stuff in your operating system, right? Much longer generation on an operating system than a browser. So we see greater recombination there. All right, now if rarity is king, then the advantage will always swing from one to another, right? From attacker to attackee and back again, because we're going to continue to ratchet up that arms race, right? Now, Professor Tooby says, parasites must always choose. In competition with each other, must continuously chase the most common host and thus poison the well against that type of host, right? So as parasites compete with each other, they're going after, of course, whatever the most common host they can latch onto. So this actually suggests a solution, what I call security through hipsterism. If you adapt platforms that aren't popular, just for the sake of them not being popular, they should actually have better security. There's a lot less malware out there for Mac systems than there are for Windows systems. Is the Apple operating system inherently more secure? Is it coded that much better? I don't really know. Maybe, but I think the driving force is that there are so much fewer people using Apple devices, right? That means there's a smaller population of hosts for a parasite to infect, meaning that it's more secure. It's a smaller target, right? So even by evolutionary means, we should expect software with a smaller market share to be more secure. All right, can we fix malware with sex? Sex is all about parasites. It's probably the first time you've heard that. I hope. But the whole idea of bothering with sex is a real puzzle for evolution, right? It's inherently inefficient. If the whole idea is just to pass your genes on, the fastest way to do that is to clone yourself, right? The whole idea of sex is like, no, I'm not just going to sit home and be like, yeah, I should probably have a kid. Pop, it's done, right? You got yourself a little clone yourself. Instead, nature seems to have bothered with sex. The whole idea that, like, okay, first we're going to divide a population. So if you want to reproduce, you got to go looking for other people, which is a pain. Then you have to hope that the person is the opposite sex, otherwise the deal's off right away, right? For reproduction. We're talking about nature. They don't bang for fun, right? So there has to be a member of the opposite sex. That has to happen, and then so there's this lengthy, very inefficient process to go about doing it. So why bother, right? Because it is a very difficult, very costly process. But diversity in genes makes a species significantly more resistant to parasites, and sexual reproduction is one of the fastest ways to switch up genes, right? Simply I pass on half of mine, half of someone else's. They're going to recombine, and now we have a whole new system, right? So it's actually a way to very quickly change up the pattern, right? Change up the platform that the parasite is trying to attack. Right? So if we want to take from this, we want to say, okay, well, how do I secure this? How do I protect myself from malware? I think the idea is how can we increase diversity? And I would say that in this case, it's increased diversity of platform, right? So consider the BYOD problem from an ecological standpoint. In that case, right, we have this big problem, right? We have people bringing all their devices. We have we got Android devices, iPhones, all this stuff, right? Well, from an ecological stability standpoint, this is great news. Yes, you're introducing more vulnerabilities that could potentially be exploited. But you also now have more than one platform. So, ecologists, one of the first things they'll look at is actually the diversity of a given ecosystem. The idea being if there isn't diversity, it's not going to last very long. Because parasites are going to find out some way to attack it. And if a disease finds out a way to attack everybody, then that entire population is at risk of extinction, right? If a parasite can get in and literally take down every single system, that's bad news. And that way, bringing your own device might actually be a more stable practice. If we are introducing more different platforms into the environment, different operating systems, different sets of software, then we're also ensuring that no one piece of malware can take down the entire system, right? So there's sort of two objectives there. There's data loss prevention and there's operational integrity. If your main concern is data loss prevention, then yeah, BYOD is a pretty big problem, right? Because now you are bringing in more malware, not malware, but more vulnerabilities, which is more ways to get in. And if you're looking at data loss prevention, then the problem is someone getting in, getting the information, getting out, right? If you just want to keep the systems up and running, in that case, this kind of diversity is actually a benefit. All right, so by having a more diverse environment, by having all these different platforms, then no one piece of malware, no one attack can take out your entire system. All right, so can we use these methods to improve software, right, to make systems more secure? I guess the question then is, can software be written stochastically, right? The whole idea behind SEX is this benefit comes from recombining genes and changing things up. And that makes it more difficult to attack. So I think there are some examples of that where we've already seen that happen, right? So in the real world, address space layout randomization, right? ASLR is a way to randomize memory patterns, right? So that a given exploit will have a much harder time getting, say, like a buffer overflow to work, right? Without this, you say, okay, well, here's what I want to exploit. I want my pointer right here. If we got ASLR, we're going to randomize that so it's a lot harder to find that, right? So we're essentially mixing up the attack surface. We're recombining it in much the same way genes are recombined when people have sex or reproduce via sex. Right. Well, what else can we do with that? I guess, can software be written that way? The literal example then, if you really wanted to make the most of this technique, I think what you do would be to randomize some of the platforms in your environment, test them, and continue to go with what works. Right? If you were really going to take this method to heart, if you're going to say, okay, I want this sexual reproduction to determine how my IT environment looks, what you do is start randomly assigning platforms, right? You get Windows, you get Windows, you get Linux, you get Linux, you get Chrome, Firefox, right? So randomly distribute all those things. Let them run for a few months. Now take a look at who's got the most help desk calls, who had the most viruses, AV alerts, and things like that. Take the platforms that had the most viruses, alerts, help desk calls, and get rid of them. Take the ones that had the fewest calls, and take that platform and replace the ones you just threw out. Right? That would literally be taking the survival of the fittest of software platforms in your environment. That way you could actually change up your system the same way sex changes genes. All right, third way nature fights back against parasites is an immune system, which is inherently complicated. I mean, simple animals can't get away with it because it's that complicated a system. We don't see it until reptiles and more advanced life forms. And for it to be at all successful, an immune system has to be adaptive, right? Now, I don't know as far as creating a immune system for our software is obviously what security vendors are attempting to do, right? And it's what AV is trying to do. I mean, at multiple different levels. Your AV, your IPS, these are all different attempts to add an immune system to these systems. Okay, so I've run through a number of I thought interesting theories as far as what we don't pull out of it. I'd like to explore a bit as far as where those came from, because I think we have the opportunity to lean on these formal models a bit more. And the whole idea behind a formal model is to specify how you think the world works as simply as possible, and typically through a mathematical equation. If you can boil how a system works down to its most basic systems, now we can articulate it that way, right? Now this gives us there's a few benefits to doing it this way. Scientists use these mathematical models to formalize their ideas. The idea is to formalize it in as simple as language as possible. Now that's arguable, right? I'm going to show you some of these systems. If it's been a while since you've done calculus, this is not going to look simple at all, right? It's going to look very complicated. And that way, it's not a simple language. That being said, if you hit the very basic learning curve and say, okay, I learned a little bit of math in order to understand formal models, then you are working with a very efficient language. If you say, I think the world works this way, someone come along and say, no, I'm going to add this one variable, and now we can explore my idea behind it. I'm going to change one little thing in your model. I'm going to tweak this variable. I'm going to add this parameter, and let's see how it looks that way. So we can explore very easily that way. So we can rigorously explore the dynamics of the model. If I have a system of equations saying, this is how I think the world works, well, let's run it through a simulation, right? Put it in a script, fire it up, run the mathematical equation, see what happens. The idea being that it makes predictions. So you have a model, it makes predictions, you test the predictions. right? If your model says, I think A is going to happen, and you can demonstrate that A will never ever happen, what you have is a shitty theory. You can go back to the board and revolve, right? This is the whole idea behind a good scientific model is it creates predictions you can test. And then once you're satisfied that it actually does explain the world, now we can use it to predict the future and help understand how things work. So here's an example. It's called the Locke-Volterra model after the guys who wrote it, more often called a predator and prey model. Now what we have are two differential equations describing the change in two different species. Say, the number of host or prey, or let's say in our case, I'll say y is a amount of malware out there in the system, or and typically a predator, right? So we have these two different equations describing how they change over time. The idea being, alpha is going to say, okay, how much would a software platform grow if there were no malware attacking it? B is going to, or beta here is going to reflect on, the impact of malware. How much will that adversely affect it? Gamma here, the death rate the malware would have if that software didn't exist at all. And then delta, the response of malware to the size of the software population. If this looks like nonsense, that's fine. I'll come back to what this actually generates in a second. The idea is we have these equations. We can rearrange a mathematical equation to explore it, right? A mathematical equation is a sentence that is inherently true, right? It's that simple a language. If I write down an equation, it's like a sentence that I can now manipulate and have the truth. So if malware is growing, right, we want to explore whether malware is rising. Well, then dy dt greater than 0, right? That's telling us, okay, the amount of malware out there is growing. If we set that equation to greater than 0, we can show that it actually, use some algebra, it recombines like this. And what these parameters are really saying is this right here. Malware is going to grow if its infection rate is greater than the rate of the host it's killing, right? So if we actually take those equations and simulate them like we have here, we get the levels of these two different parameters, x and y, predator and prey, or host and parasite, right? So in this case, the original model was actually done for rabbits and foxes. For sharks and fish they eat. Works exactly with fox and rabbits and a lot of other predator-prey interactions, and I think possibly parasites and hosts as well. The idea being, once we see this tremendous growth here in our little bunny population, we get to the point where there's so many bunnies, it's a bunny buffet for foxes, right? So they've got all the food they can eat, they go nuts. Now they're so fat and happy, they're reproducing like crazy. So we see a little bit after this growth in the fox population. Well, now there's way too many foxes, and they're eating all the rabbits. Now there's not enough rabbits for the foxes to eat. So they start going hungry. And you'll see the fox population die off here as the rabbit population is killed off. And then now that there are fewer foxes, the rabbits flourish. Right? Now there's lots of rabbits to eat. Foxes start growing as well, and that cycle actually continues over time. Right? So again, I showed that slide earlier where we showed the change in malware. Is exactly the kind of cycle we should see between malware and security tools. Right? Now, when you have a system of equations, you can explore a solution, right? If I have a system of dynamic equations, first I want to look at, okay, well, what's stable? And then how do the dynamics work? Well, there's a stable solution actually at 0, 0. That means there's 0 predators, 0 prey, right? So extinction of both, right? Not very interesting. And then there's this one stable period, depending on the parameters of the model, and the rest of the time we see periodic fluctuations. Right? So if we actually plot out the changes, we get a field map like this, which is basically saying, okay, if I have this amount of prey, say there's 200 rabbits out here, and let's say there's 100 foxes, I'd say find here on the graph, so 2 and 1 there. So we find it, and you'll see that the arrows are sort of pointing this way. Right? So it's growing. You'll see that we're actually pushing up. So we're growing the number of predators until we get to a certain point where it's going to crash and come back around, and actually going to work around the circle continuously. Right? So how wild the fluctuations will be depending on where you are, really how far out from the stable point in the center. Right? So we can generate this model formally and actually explore, like, well, okay, well, how bad is it going to be? I mean, if we were to, say, compare those different parameters for different types of malware, right? How fast they spread, how likely are they to hurt a host, we can actually show different types of cycles for different types of malware, right? All right. So let me change gears a minute and talk about epidemiology. Epidemiology is the idea of let's fight a disease, but at a very high level, right? So if you think about the difference between an epidemiologist and a physician, or a very significant difference, right? The physician is, I'm working with a patient. I'm trying to diagnose a problem. I'm trying to cure that disease. Well, the epidemiologist is typically looking at the entire environment, right? How do I wipe out this disease from the entire population? So in our example, epidemiology is a very different view from, say, getting your hands on malware, reverse engineering it, coming up with a way to block that malware, right? That's very narrow focus. Epidemiology would be a much more high-level look at the environment. Now, is that a good idea? Well, if we have the ability to do a low-level inspection, if I can inspect the malware, get my hands on it, and do it that way, that's obviously a better way to do it, right? It's also very costly, right? Talented people that can do that kind of analysis are few and far between, and the labor market shows that they're going to be hard to get anyway, right? So that this high-level view could actually be a better way of addressing threats, especially if we have an infection that is not well understood, or if the solution is expensive, right? So a formal model of epidemiology, we have the Kermack-McKendrick model, again, the original authors. But what they do is they model three different equations. Here's the number of susceptible people, the number of infected people, and the number of recovered people. They being people move between those states. And they actually show that there's a sort of tipping point where if there's a lot of susceptible people, a malware could get in there, or parasite or whatever it is, and you'll see it grow, and to the point where you just run out of susceptible people because they drop out, they die, or they're cured. So there's just not many susceptible people. You reach a tipping point, and we see the amount of that malware plummet, right? So to explore that, we have is three different, everyone in this environment is three different states. You're susceptible, and then like a certain percentage of them, marked by beta, can become infected. A certain percentage of which, marked by gamma here, can sort of then become recovered. And then there's also a natural death rate they'll throw in there. So when you look at it, you get three different equations to model that process, right? Here's the number of susceptible people. They're going to bump into a certain number of infected people. And then a percentage of them, marked by beta, are actually going to become infected. They're going to move on here, where they might be cured and move out, or they might just die naturally, right? And then we have recovered people coming in from those infected people who are cured, and then you can a natural death rate of recovered people as well. So again, if this is looking weird, it's fine. We can ignore it. We can still play with the model, even if the equations are hard to solve, right? So again, if we want to find a system where the infection is decreasing, well, we'll look at, right, DIDT is less than 0. So the amount of malware is shrinking. The amount of parasites shrinking, the amount of disease is shrinking. Again, we can rearrange and show that, okay, if that's true, then what we're saying is that the malware is going to shrink when the amount of susceptible people out there are less than this ratio here of the parameters we have. Which is basically saying that this contagion is going to continue to spread as long as it can, right? If we're dying out faster, then it can connect to other people and spread. Then it's not going to be very successful. Now, does that describe malware? Certainly not all of it. I mean, if you write malware with the expressed purpose of infecting a single host, getting one file and getting out of there, an epidemiological model is not going to describe it at all, right? Because here we're looking at contagion, right? It's users connect to each other, talk to each other, and the malware can spread that way. Not going to describe an advanced threat, but consider a botnet or something that wants to get as many infections out there as possible in order to harvest passwords or zombies to put to work, right? In that case, I think an epidemiological model is going to describe it very well, because we do have that contagion factor. So we can learn from that. And what that comes down to, I mean, this value here, the inverse of it is what epidemiologists call the basic reproduction rate. And that number comes down to be the key in a lot of their theories, right? Once we know that number for a given infection, right? Once we can figure this out, we're going to have a good way on how to start fighting it. So it's actually one of the first things that epidemiologists want to know when we're fighting an infection, what's that R value? How fast is it really spreading? Because that's going to tell me how nasty it is. If you look at farmers' almanacs, it will actually describe various diseases that affect cattle. It will give the R value for it. I mean, here's some examples. The idea being here, rabies has an R value of 2.44. It means on average, for every person infected with rabies, they are going to spread the contagion to 2.44 people on average, right? So this term is going to describe just how nasty the effect is. Smallpox, for example, 3.5 to 6. Whooping cough is actually 16 to 18 when it's estimated. Very, very nasty disease. It's why it's one of the ones where, you know, inoculated at birth and then like when you go to college, right? So this is primary determinant how epidemiologists turn and attack these things. Farmers also use it to determine like how much could it spread, right? Farmers will look at this number, and I forget the formula off the top of my head, but they'll from the R value, they'll determine how many cattle can they have together, right? If you know a disease spreads so fast, well then what I need is smaller and smaller groups of my cattle so that it can't spread very fast. It's actually called a herd immunity. The idea being, I mean, if you can go out and inoculate every one of these cows against the disease, great. But it's often expensive, and a lot of times they don't have those cures. So if we isolate people that enough that the contagion will die out on its own, we can do it that way, right? Now, I don't know if a botnet will necessarily die out on its own, but it's certainly going to affect the monetary value in the person writing the botnet, right? The whole idea of sitting down and writing the botnet is that I believe I'm going to have a contagion that can get around and affect as many people as possible. If you take that away, you're going to remove the economic incentive to write that malware in the first place. Malaria is actually a fascinating example. The original estimations for the basic reproduction rate of malaria put it somewhere between 50 and 100. That a single infection would, one person infected with malaria would lead somewhere between 50 and 100 secondary infections. That number has actually been revised because when they looked at malaria, they were considering all of it at one time. Turns out there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different strains of malaria. So if you don't identify the different strains as different types, it looks worse than it actually is. If you isolate a single strain, the reproduction rate is 6 to 7. I would draw the corollary instantaneously between that and polymorphic malware, right? Very hard to catch if it's changing up, but if it changed one little thing, some security solutions still might identify it, right? Others won't. But it depends on how much we change, and we see the same sort of response there, where if we look at a single strain, doesn't look nearly as bad, but if we lump all malaria together, it looks absolutely devastating. If we run this system and plot it over time, that's okay. One thing that I think is interesting is we see natural oscillations even when you're having an effect that malware is going away. You get this sort of natural oscillation as it dampens out. So one lesson to take away with that, if you are finding a botnet, or something that follows this process, it's going to be hard to determine if your security controls are having an effect. Because as we move through time, you can see it is actually getting better. But if your boss comes along on this day and asks, okay, where are we? How many people are infected? You've gone up from the day before. Now he's yelling at you for actually a wrong reason. This is actually a natural progression. This is actually being successful in getting rid of this and going away. So due to these natural oscillations, you have to be careful when looking at metrics and trying to judge the efficacy of your controls. Stable equilibrium. Yeah, there's some more math, but let me jump past that because I want to show off a quick extension to this model. Where instead of just having this one type of people, like before we had, the susceptible infected recovery was one type of individual that would move through these same stages. What we want to do is model instead two different types of people. And let's say we have our regular users here, and here we have our high-risk users. All right, so here we have high-risk users, and this could be a really low percentage of our users, say 10%. But say these high-risk users are far, far more likely to get infected. Well, what happens in the model when we look at it that way? What happens is these high-risk users end up driving almost all of the effect. So here we have short-term dynamics where I've simulated the system and introduced a small amount of the contagion into the low-risk users. And you see it's actually going down. Right? The low-risk users know not to spread it around. They're better. They're not going to infect as many people. But if it gets onto a few high-risk users, that starts taking off and growing that way. So over a long period of time, it'll look like that. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to start speeding up here. Happy to answer more questions there. So again, to go back to what we actually learned from epidemiology, let's look at gonorrhea. Again, not something I've had to say before. Do you think there's going to be a picture? Thought about it. Parasites were scary enough. There's a limit to how much I want to terrify you, right? So that breaking up of risk structure turns out to be vitally important to learning how sexually transmitted infections spread. And epidemiologists actually have to split out the population into like a core, adjacent, and periphery risk groups in order to understand how it spreads, right? And if you want to secure an environment like this, you have to understand this too, right? Because if we look out on the edges in the periphery here, we have a lot of people who've slept with, one or two people. The risk of getting contagion from those people, incredibly low, right? But then we have our sort of in the middle here, our adjacent users. They've slept with a few more people. Then the question really becomes, okay, has the people in the adjacents ever slept with anyone in the core group? And that's almost where all the infection spreading has come from, right? So it comes back to identifying these people in the middle here in order to figure out, okay, how is this infection really being spread? Now, if we, so actually what they've done here, this is an actual map. They went through, did a survey of this I want to say high school. It was over time, so I think it was like freshman year of college as well. Map of all the students there. Okay, who have you slept with? And actually mapped it out this way, and we're able to spread or track how infections spread through the population there. It's very much a hub and spokes kind of model here, right? And if you want to stop the epidemic from spreading, you can save, I don't know how much time and money by identifying the hub, right? So if we look at this, I did that, right? So if you have a cure, say you've got anti-malware tool or whatever, and you're putting it out there on the people on the periphery, it's not really having an effect. Those were your low-risk users. They didn't need the protection you're giving them. To eradicate this infection, we must inoculate the high-risk host. If we're going to modify our example to have like a security system, we're going to vaccinate a certain number of hosts. I'll sort of redo these equations, but we're going to add security to a certain percentage of hosts right here, the value P. So they're going to be pulled out, and we'll cure them. Well, what happens is we're reducing the damage of that piece of malware, right? Here's our reproduction ratio. We're actually essentially limiting it by reducing it, with higher amount of people getting the security system, higher this p-value, lower we're going to reduce this effective threat of the malware. Let's skip that. So let's plot out who we actually need to cure. On the bottom here, we have the percentage of high-risk hosts that you've inoculated or vaccinated, and the percentage total number of hosts. What this curve is telling us is that if I just randomly select people and give them the security solution, well, if I'm randomly selecting people, say, so this model, 20% of the population was high risk. If I randomly select people, about 20% of the people vaccinated are going to be 20%, and it's not going to cure it. So I have to be on this blue line or above it in order to eradicate this infection. So if I randomly select 30% of the high-risk people and give them the vaccination, come up the line, go over here. I have to give the security solution also to over 60% of my total environment. That being said, if I'm able to identify more of my high-risk hosts, or high-risk users, right? Say I identify 80% of them here, trace the line over, get about 25, 30%. So if you have to buy an advanced malware tool and get it out there, another agent on the desktop, you can actually, if you can identify your high-risk threats, you're going to end up having to buy, less than half as many licenses for it. If you can identify the high-risk users, you're going to stop threats spreading as a contagion that much more effectively, right? Because of the nature of the way they spread. Those high-risk users are the ones bringing it in, right? So if you can identify them, you're going to be far better off. I don't know how you do that. That's an interesting question. Help desk cases. If you've got a proxy or a web filter, you could probably look up like web reputation, right? And pull out the logs of who's going to the most suspicious sites, low reputation sites, things like that. All right, so you absolutely want to do that. What other predictions can I make? I think one of the things we will see in the future is good malware that keeps out bad malware. Looking at the way parasites evolve, I think that's the next evolution of malware. Like, hey, I want to be on this host to capture as many passwords as possible. If bad malware gets on here and goes blue screening the system, you're going to put on AV. I can't have that. So I think we'll actually see really good malware preventing bad malware from infecting. Right, like the tapeworm. It's that well evolved, most people don't ever notice it. A couple other, right? Yeah. What's more important, keeping the system up or protecting your data? As far as stopping an epidemic, that could have a very different effect on how you're going to go about it. Huge, huge return and enormous cost savings on your security tools if you can identify your high-risk users and hosts. Let's see. Oh, come on. Right, and we'll never stop spinning. Everything, malware keeps evolving, and it will never stop evolving. So one of the things you need to be doing is grilling your vendors on how does your tool change? How agile is your tool? If the threat changes, are you going to be of any value to me, right? So this is something you should be grilling on. Okay, well, what has changed in your tool in the past 5, 10 years, right? How are you in a position to change in the future, right? Those are the kind of questions you should be grilling your vendors over, right? So if malware takes a leap of evolution, are the tools you have going to be any good? And should you standardize on a single platform? It's easier to eradicate if you have a single platform, but of course easier to manage, right? So we have that ecological stability. And I am seriously out of time. I'll stick around for any questions. Sorry I can't take them now, but I don't want to run over anymore. So I gotta get off the stage. So if you have any questions, please feel free to hit me up. I'll be around. And thank you. Thanks for coming to hear me talk here.